Hello everybody! It is Jay here with a tag video, something that original tag that I've been tagged by the originator of the tag. This is the What is Your Poetry tag by Matt Wall, Paperback Junkie, where he's asking you what your poetry is. And I'm doing this tag, and he's probably tagged me because he brought to my notice a challenge that Zoe B was running on her channel, which is the 100 poem not 100 poem challenge, where starting on April 1st, you write a poem a day for 100 days. And I've completed that. I've written 100 poems, or at least 100 drafts of poems, getting kind of grinding one out each day. And I found out about this actually a little bit late. I was whenever Matt actually did his video on it, calling attention to this, saying, hey, this is a cool thing, anyone else gonna try? And I was like, oh, that is a cool thing, and it's got that daily grind aspect of it, which I really enjoy. So I embarked upon that and wrote a poem a day. It was an interesting process of just like, okay, every day sit down, write a poem. I am a dabbler in all things. Every once in a while written a poem. I had taken some creative writing courses in way back in the day, like 20 years ago or more now, where I'd taken creative writing poetry classes and stuff like that. So I'd had experience of doing it before, but it had been a long time since I'd actually had any systematic thing of like, okay, write a poem a day. Now, some of them were I really, it was like, okay, I have 10 or 15 minutes, and I would just start writing. Some of them I had, oh, I've got an image in my head and I'm going to do it. Other times it's like, I have no idea, but hey, this is the time I have. So I would just write. And they got strangely longer and more rambly, which is probably the antithesis of actual poetry. I was probably just more having a conversation in that form as I went along. But it was an interesting process, and it kind of it unlocks. I felt like it unlocked a couple of things for me creatively, that writing a story. I usually try and have been trying to do kind of just writing stories each day, and well, a story over a bunch of days. But it was an interesting thing to just like, okay, you just sit down and you do something, and you have a beginning and an end in that session, and that's that. So yeah, thank you, Matt, for that. And I thought, to celebrate that, I would do his poetry tag video. That's my incredibly long preamble, but thank you, Matt, for that. So yes, let's do the prompts. Now that I've yacked for so long. Number one, do you prefer metaphor or simile? I know Matt had a bit of a rant on this one that you could go look for. So a metaphor is like, I made sure I got everything. It's like what Grammerly said. Well, both similes and metaphors are used to make comparisons. The difference between similes and metaphors comes down to a word. Simile use the word like or as to compare things. Life is like a box of chocolates. In contrast, metaphors directly state a comparison. Love is a battlefield. And there's the whole thing of, you need both. It's tools in the toolbox. You don't give up screws because you only like nails. So you would want to use both. I think if I'm going to lean towards one, especially in the context of poetry, I'll go with, I probably prefer metaphor. It feels like it's more magic to me. It's like transformative thing. But it's one of those things of, you need both. But yeah, okay, I will stake it on metaphor. And yes, metaphors can be used horribly and overused. Like everything else in writing, everything can be abused or perfectly done. You look for the poets that can perfectly use stuff, and that sometimes that can be few and far between. So that's number two. What is the most important element in a poem for you? Form, structure, meaning, feeling, sound, alliteration, assonance, consonance, etc. And you can't say them all. I would probably go with meaning imagery. So, the poem means something and it shows me something, preferably in a different way than I've thought about it or seen it before. I think that's why poetry is such a hard thing to read. I think you could read a poem a month and still not get everything out of it. One poem and work on that poem and drill down, because a really great poem is something that is going to burrow into your mind and actually change the way you see about the world significantly. I mean, a poem that is really, really, really working, and I'm so hidebound and fixed that it takes me a long time to be able to kind of flip and like, oh my God, the picture comes into focus. So yeah, that meaning and imagery building. Language less so. Whole straight kind of just language poets who are all about that. If it's only language, it's not interesting. If it's language that you can't grasp, on I want multiple layers and I want them all to work, but if it doesn't work on the top layer, then I'm probably not going to be able to focus enough on it to get through a poem. I find that when I go through poetry collections, you read through a whole bunch of poems. I remember this with I was reading Thomas Hardy's a collection of his older poems, and there's like it's interesting how you'll be reading along. It's like, oh yeah, that one's okay, and then like, oh, something will vibrate in a poem. And it's like, okay, that one I'm gonna take back later, and I'm gonna reread it. And I'm gonna keep on burrowing down because that one, for some reason, that one vibrated for me, and that's usually when I'll really look at it. I think I did a video on that a long time ago that's hanging around somewhere. If I haven't deleted it, I may publish that around the same time as this video, of just like, there's something that for some reason that vibrated for me, and it made me focus on that and read down and try and get down at least a couple of layers on that poem. Number 3, what is your favorite school/movement in poetry? I don't know. I think it's probably the lyric poetry, uh, personal, I don't know if it's confessional, because like I think of like I like Catullus, I like Eileen Miles, and there's in some way that they're both very much dealing with their very own messy personal personas. They're Catullus obsessing over his girlfriend. Eileen Miles, just her own kind of they're working over their stuff. It's just like they're vastly separated in time and space, but somehow that makes a field to me of it's a person there. There's a person talking to me, that vibrates, I guess, is my favorite kind of poetry. Not that there's other poetry that I like as well. That's probably a very illiterate way of me to say what I respond to in poetry. Number 4, since we see the world through a poet's eyes, does a poet have to live an interesting life for you to like their poetry? I think they have to live an interesting inner life to produce interesting poetry for me. I don't know if I'm interested in their personal lives as such. I mean, there's some poets who have, they have stories. They're for some reason, whatever, how the life they've lived is a story now. I think of someone like Sylvia Plath, where it's really sad that her personal life has in some ways overshadowed the poetry. I'm sure more people know about Sylvia Plath's personal life than have actually read her poetry, or her novel for that matter. I'm always slightly, that it's almost like it's the market. It's like when people trumpet a poet's life, it's like, okay, well, that's marketing. What about the actual poetry? All this other stuff, it's gonna fade. If the poetry is great, the poetry will stay, but all this other stuff is going to fade away. We know nothing about Shakespeare or Catullus or Chaucer. Really, we hardly know anything about them, but the poetry stays. And I think that's the thing that's the most interesting, which isn't to say I'm not interested in somebody's interesting life, but it becomes a secondary. So yeah, I don't think they have to they have to have lived and have to have lived an interesting life, though. It's probably it's someone's got to be fundamentally interesting for their poetry to vibrate, to work, to catch you. um it doesn't mean they're wonderful people or anything like that, but they have to be interesting. It has to catch you somehow, or they have to, there's some kind of a confluence of when they were that, and what their position was, or maybe they were just the observer to interesting times, and that they captured that in their work. So it doesn't have to be the poet themselves, any as much as it has to be any other kind of an artist. It's not necessarily that, and sometimes that's the luck of the draw. There's the sheer talent and force, but there's also just the time that you live. Someone who was pre a moment in history and lived and died, they nothing came out of it because it's just not something that resonated with uh, their world, or the worlds that got created afterwards and came from that moment. Number 6, Whitman said to have great poets there must be great audiences. Bukowski said to have great audience you need great poets, and I said, unless you have a great places for those two to meet, it doesn't matter. What's your take? Um, I mean, I think audiences probably attract the great artists. I think really great people who have a genius to connect, um, they probably funnel themselves into what connects. I think about all the novelists that we could have now, but I think there are people have rightly said, "Oh, writing scripts for TV or for movies is actually where I'm actually going to make the most impact, and also make the most make the most money." I think there is those people who are bullheaded who's like, no, I am a poet and this is all I can do. I cannot write a screenplay or whatever. This is what I'm going to do, and they'll continue whether there's going to be the audience there and whether there's going to be the recognition. This kind of goes back to my thing of interesting times. Seems like the people who get attracted to that and hone in on that are also going to find the medium. So I probably would go the audience conjures captures the great, attracts the great artists. It's like poetry seems like I love the poetry that really resonates with me. I love, but it seems to be it's a niche audience, and a niche audience of like, you read and then you read poetry. It seems to be extremely tiny, and you get even worse, that you get this kind of incredibly hermetically sealed specialist intellectualist poetry, which is unfriendly to having a larger audience. Stuff that I think I've heard Matt rail about, is like a symptom of that. It's like, we're small, so we're the higher and the fewer, to quote great philosophy on Star Trek. So yeah, the higher the fewer is just, it's kind of, it seems to be that sad contracting of things. So we'll get into that in later questions. Number 7, who do you think has advanced poetry the most? I don't know. As an ignoramus, I would probably think, if we're talking about English poetry, the very limited stuff I do know would be English poetry. I mean, you've got someone like Chaucer writing. You've got Shakespeare, people who are writing at significant turning points in literature, contributing to the history, the tradition of literature of the time. Those seem like There's a reason why they're giants who've stayed and that we continue to study, because they made a big impact on how we all speak today. Um, so I don't know what you would say nowadays. Let's make friends with Steve Donahue and say, oh, probably Bob Dylan. Probably Bob Dylan has made the greatest impact on poetry today. I'm doing that more for shock value for Steve Donahue than I am for anything else, because I know he's a big fan of Dylan and was super happy when he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Just super happy about that. Uh, yes. Number 8. Since the rise of the moderns and free-form verse over the last 50 years, and more currently the rise of insta poetry, what movements of poetry do you think the future holds? I'm an old dude, and I've vaguely heard about insta poetry and performance poetry and slam poetry, and it's all passed me by. It's completely all passed me by. Um, I have no clue. I mean, I think if anything, it's like what could break poetry out from the tiny place it holds in culture? What could make it everywhere? Twitter poetry. I mean, I think the best thing that could happen to poetry is if there was a horrible collapse, we were all bombed back into just the Stone Age, and we had to all sit around and entertain ourselves each night. Then poetry could rise again, where there's nothing on TV because there's no TV anymore. There's no internet, and it's all destroyed. We could go back to something where people would gather around and perform for each other, and a part of that performance, other than maybe plays, would be poetry. And we'd all be doing we'd all be doing Lord Byron through Bob Dylan. Where have you been, my blue-eyed son? Where have you been, my darling young one? Yes, that's probably where. It would be great for poetry. It would really suck for the rest of us. So, you know, that's not a very happy point to leave on. I mean, I've really enjoyed writing 100 poems over the last 100 days, and here I am saying the only way we could actually get anything back to that would be if we blew everything up, caused untold misery and death. Well, it would make for a great poem, though, wouldn't it? Slouching towards Bethlehem and everything. Yes, I think that is my contribution to the what is your poetry tag. And I'm not advocating for Armageddon, but I am advocating for people to take a look at poetry and to read poetry and to write poetry, especially just to write it, to just understand how kind of a concentrated and kind of tricksy. I can see why people who are poets are also maybe people who do crossword puzzles. There's sort of a kind of a puzzle box to poetry writing, to the intricate little. It's like you're making a watch, and now I'm mixing all my metaphors. It's like you're making a watch, and you've got all these tiny little pieces that have to fit perfectly together to hopefully start ticking, much less tell the time properly. And the greatest poetry is put together so that not only does it tick, but it tells you the time. And that is invaluable. And who knows, maybe there will be Twitter poetry, and that will be something that will capture people's imagination, but they're going to have to stop and pause for long enough to do it, because that's the thing about poetry is you have to pause, and you have to kind of find a stillness to really sit with something for a while. It's almost like kind of a meditation in a way. Not that you can't also have an immediate response as well, but when you have that, after you have that immediate response, it means like you need to go back and look at it again and again and get and sink into it, which is the thing that I love about poetry. So I love poetry. All right, I have rambled now. Thank you, Matt. Sorry about my answers for this long ass tag that I did. And yeah, here's to the next 100 poems. More videos later.